The wind at the Grafenwehr firing range was howling, but it couldn't drown out the commander's mocking laughter. He handed her a busted, unzeroed rifle, expecting a public and humiliating failure. He didn't know the quiet woman standing before him had survived hell on earth and was about to bring it to him. The freezing November rain over the Grafenwehr training area in Germany had turned the ground into a miserable, soul-sucking slurry of mud and crushed gravel. It was the kind of weather that tested the absolute limits of an infantryman's patience, which meant it was the perfect environment for a high-stakes NATO joint readiness exercise. Commanding the sprawling simulated battlefield was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds was a man carved from old-school military doctrine, a veteran of 2 tours in the Arghandab River Valley, and a commander who believed that true authority was earned entirely in the dirt. He was a broad-shouldered, severe man who wore his airborne tab like a crown. To Reynolds, there were only 2 types of people in the world: the men he commanded and the desk jockeys who got in their way. And then there was Samantha Hayes. She had arrived 2 days prior, stepping off a Black Hawk transport with no fanfare, no entourage, and absolutely no insignia on her olive-drab tactical jacket. According to the limited briefing packet Reynolds had skimmed and subsequently tossed in the trash, Hayes was a Department of Defense tactical liaison. In Reynolds' mind, that was Pentagon speak for an auditor, a civilian analyst sent from Washington to critique his battalion's combat efficiency from the comfort of a heated tent. Hayes didn't look like a typical analyst, but she didn't look like a soldier to them either. She was lean, moving with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion that most of the loud, boisterous infantrymen failed to notice. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense braid, and her eyes, a pale, icy blue, seemed to process the chaos of the command center with the chilling detachment of a security camera. The friction between them had started almost instantly. During the morning intelligence briefing, Reynolds stood at the head of the tactical map, tapping a heavy wooden pointer against a topographical ridge. "The OPFOR opposing force is going to attempt a mechanized push through this valley," Reynolds barked, his voice carrying over the hum of the generators. "We lock down the high ground here, set our heavy guns, and we bleed them before they can flank the river. It's basic, brutal, and it works. Are we clear?" "They won't take the valley, Commander," a calm, flat voice interrupted. The command tent went dead silent. Reynolds lowered his pointer, his jaw tightening as he turned to face the back of the room. Samantha Hayes was leaning against a support beam, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee. She hadn't raised her voice, but it had cut through the heavy air of the tent with razor-sharp precision. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes," Reynolds said, heavily emphasizing the Mrs. to remind everyone in the room of her supposed civilian status. "Did you have a strategic insight you'd like to share with the men who actually do the fighting?" "I do," Hayes replied, stepping forward. She didn't flinch under the collective stares of 24 battle-hardened officers. "The OPFOR commander is using Russian mechanized doctrine, specifically a motorized rifle brigade template. They aren't going to push the valley. That's a feint. They're going to dismount a light infantry company in the tree line 3 kilometers south, hike through the night under the storm cover, and hit your command post directly while your heavy guns are facing the wrong way." A few of the junior officers exchanged nervous glances. It was a bold claim. Reynolds let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "That's a brilliant textbook theory, Miss Hayes. Very creative. But out here in the real world, infantry companies don't hike 12 miles through knee-deep mud in a freezing downpour just to attempt a suicide raid on a fortified TOC. They'll take the road. We stick to the plan." "Sir," Hayes said, her voice remaining perfectly level, completely devoid of the emotion Reynolds was trying to provoke. "I highly advise you reposition a defensive perimeter to the south. If you leave it exposed..." "I don't need advice on troop placement from a Pentagon statistician," Reynolds snapped, stepping into her personal space, using his height to try and intimidate her. "Your job is to observe and report back to your bosses in Virginia. My job is to win. Keep your theories to your spreadsheets. Dismissed." Hayes looked up at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no embarrassment, just a quiet, terrifyingly calm calculation. She held his gaze for 2 agonizingly long seconds before giving a single, subtle nod. "Understood, Commander," she said quietly, and walked out of the tent. As the tent flap closed behind her, Reynolds snorted, looking at his first sergeant, a burly man named Miller. "These people," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head, "read a few classified PDFs and suddenly they think they're special operators. Let's get out to the range. I need to smell some gunpowder." By 1400 hours, the weather had deteriorated from bad to completely abysmal. The wind was sweeping across the Grafenwehr live fire range in violent, unpredictable gusts, carrying a freezing rain that stung the exposed skin of the soldiers trying to qualify on their weapon systems. Reynolds stood behind the firing line, his arms crossed over his chest, scowling. His battalion's sharpshooters were struggling. The targets were set at 300, 400, and 500 meters, and the brutal crosswind was playing havoc with the ballistics. Ping after ping missed the steel silhouettes, kicking up puffs of wet mud in the distance. "Windage, Jensen! Adjust your damn windage!" First Sergeant Miller barked, pacing behind a frustrated corporal who had just missed his third consecutive shot at the 400-meter mark. "It's the gusts, First Sergeant. They're shifting too fast," Jensen yelled back over the crack of the rifles. Reynolds shook his head in disgust. It was a tough shoot, undoubtedly, but he demanded perfection. He turned to walk toward the warming tent to grab a fresh radio battery, and that's when he saw her. Samantha Hayes was standing quietly under the awning of the armory shack, her hands deep in the pockets of her unmarked waterproof jacket. She was watching the shooters. Her eyes tracked the invisible flight paths of the bullets, analyzing the splash of the misses in the mud, silently calculating the math of the wind. Reynolds felt a surge of irritation. He hated the idea of this Washington suit quietly judging his men. An arrogant idea sparked in his mind. He would put her in her place, permanently, right here, in front of half the battalion. He would show her the massive gulf between military theory and practical, brutal execution. "Miss Hayes!" Reynolds shouted, his voice booming over the wind. Hayes turned her head slowly, acknowledging him. She walked over, her boots making soft, even crunches in the gravel. "Commander," she replied. "You seem very interested in my men's marksmanship," Reynolds said, a wicked, patronizing smirk playing on his lips. Several of the soldiers on the line stopped what they were doing, sensing the impending drama. "Since you had so much tactical wisdom to share in the TOC this morning, I thought maybe you could show us how it's done out here in the real world." Hayes looked out at the muddy, windswept range. "I'm just observing, sir." "Oh, I insist," Reynolds said loudly, making sure the surrounding platoons could hear him. "It's easy to move markers on a map and quote doctrine. It's a little harder when the wind is blowing 15 knots and your hands are freezing. First Sergeant Miller, bring me a weapon." Miller trotted over, holding a standard-issue M4 carbine. It was a pool weapon, the kind kept in the armory for general qualification, not a meticulously maintained personal rifle. It was battered, the finish was rubbed off in spots, and the standard ACOG optic looked like it had seen better decades. Reynolds snatched the rifle from Miller and shoved it toward Hayes. "Go ahead, Miss Hayes. Show these boys how a Pentagon analyst takes down a 400-meter target in a crosswind." The surrounding soldiers fell silent. A few of the younger privates exchanged amused smirks. This was a classic hazing ritual for civilian contractors, but Reynolds was pushing it to a cruel extreme. The weapon wasn't zeroed to her, the weather was atrocious, and she was wearing civilian gloves. It was a guaranteed failure. Hayes looked at the rifle suspended between them. For a moment, she did absolutely nothing. She just stared at it. "Too heavy?" Reynolds mocked, his smirk widening into a grin. Hayes slowly pulled her hands out of her pockets. She reached out and took the weapon. The moment her hands touched the rifle, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift happened in her posture. To the untrained eye, she just looked like a woman holding a gun. But to anyone who truly knew the craft of violence, the signs were glaring. Her trigger finger automatically indexed high and flat along the receiver. Her left hand clamped onto the handguard with a perfect, aggressive clamp grip. She didn't fumble, she didn't adjust. The weapon simply became an extension of her body. She stepped up to the firing line. The mud was slick, but she rooted her boots into the earth with perfect, balanced tension. "Range is hot, sweetheart," Reynolds taunted, crossing his arms. "Let's see what you've got." Hayes brought the optic to her eye. The rifle was resting against her shoulder, pressed tightly into the pocket. She didn't close her left eye. She kept both eyes open, a hallmark of elite combat shooters, allowing her peripheral vision to track the chaotic wind patterns whipping across the tall grass. She breathed in. The chaotic noise of the range, the howling wind, the murmurs of the men. Reynolds' heavy breathing behind her seemed to vanish. Crack. Her first shot missed. It impacted the mud about 2 feet to the right of the 300-meter steel target. A ripple of laughter echoed from the grunts behind her. "Don't worry, Miss Hayes," Corporal Jensen called out. "The safety is off at least." Reynolds chuckled. "A little high and right, analyst. The wind is pushing it. You have to compensate." Hayes didn't react to the laughter. She didn't lower the weapon. She had deliberately taken a throwaway shot. She wasn't trying to hit the target. She was reading the weapon's zero and feeling the horrific, gritty trigger pull of the unmaintained rifle. Now she knew exactly how badly the optic was misaligned, and exactly how many pounds of pressure the sear needed to break. She exhaled slowly, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Her heart rate plummeted to a rhythmic, resting crawl. She shifted her point of aim into empty space, aiming seemingly at nothing, calculating the violent leftward gust. Crack. Ping. The distinct, high-pitched ring of lead-slapping AR-500 steel at 300 meters echoed back. The laughter abruptly stopped. "Lucky shot," Reynolds muttered. Hayes didn't hear him. She was already transitioning. Her upper body moved like a turret on a tank, completely isolated from her lower body. She snapped to the 400-meter target. Crack. Ping. Crack. Ping. 2 shots fired in less than a second, both dead center mass. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the firing line. First Sergeant Miller lowered his binoculars, his jaw slightly open. Hayes wasn't done. She fluidly shifted her stance, dropping her center of gravity to combat the wind, and aimed at the furthest target on the ridge 500 meters. The wind was whipping violently up there, tearing the rain sideways. She waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. She was reading the grass, waiting for the briefest lull between the gusts. Crack. Ping. Crack. Ping. Crack. Ping. 3 rapid-fire shots. A perfect fist-sized grouping on a 500-meter target with a battered, unzeroed pool rifle in a 1.5-knot crosswind. Hayes slowly lowered the weapon. She flicked the selector switch back to safe with her thumb, the motion so fluid and fast it was almost a blur. She pressed the magazine release, caught the magazine in her left hand, and racked the charging handle to eject the live round from the chamber, catching it cleanly out of the air before it could hit the mud. She turned around and handed the cleared rifle, the magazine, and the loose bullet back to a totally dumbfounded First Sergeant Miller. The entire range was dead silent, save for the howling wind. Nobody was smirking. Corporal Jensen looked like he had just seen a ghost. Hayes looked at Commander Reynolds. The smug, arrogant grin had been completely erased from his face, replaced by a pale, rigid look of absolute shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "The trigger sear is badly worn, and the optic is zeroed 2 MOA to the right," Hayes said, her voice carrying the exact same flat, emotionless tone she had used in the command tent. "I recommend your armorers service these weapons before your men deploy, Commander. Or the OPFOR won't be the only thing they miss." Without waiting for a response, Hayes zipped her jacket up an inch higher against the cold, turned on her heel, and walked away into the freezing rain. By 0200 hours, the storm had morphed from a miserable downpour into a violent tempest. The Grafenwehr training area was pitch black, swallowed by a thick, freezing fog that reduced visibility to less than 30 feet. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, the mood was tense but arrogant. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds sat heavily in his folding chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, completely confident that the simulated enemy, the OPFOR, was hunkered down in the mud, too miserable to move. He had ignored Hayes's warning. His heavy machine guns and primary defensive lines were dug in facing the eastern valley. The southern tree line, an expanse of dense, muddy timber, was guarded by a skeleton crew of cold, exhausted sentries. In the far corner of the tent, Samantha Hayes sat quietly on a pelican case. She was fully geared up in her dark, unmarked tactical vest, her helmet resting on her knee. She was cleaning her sidearm with meticulous, rhythmic motions, her icy blue eyes occasionally darting to the southern flap of the tent. "Get some rest, Miss Hayes," First Sergeant Miller grunted, walking past her with a clipboard. "OP4 isn't moving in this garbage. We'll crush them at dawn when they try to cross the valley." Hayes slid the slide of her pistol back, chambering a dummy training round. "They are already here, First Sergeant." Before Miller could respond, the radio on the central comms desk shrieked. "TOC, this is Outpost 4. We are taking heavy simulated fire from the south. Repeat, Multiple dismounted infantry pushing from the southern tree line. They are past the wire. We are overrun. The transmission was abruptly cut off by the shrill electronic beep of a Miles gear casualty alarm, signaling that the sentry had been killed. The command tent erupted into absolute chaos. "What the hell is going on?" Reynolds roared, knocking over his coffee as he vaulted out of his chair. "Outpost 4, report! Where are they?" Pop, 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 pop. The distinct rapid crackle of blank ammunition echoed just outside the tent. It wasn't miles away in the valley. It was right on top of them. The OP-4, led by a ruthless infantry tactician named Captain John Harding, had done exactly what Hayes predicted. They had abandoned their vehicles, marched through 12 miles of freezing mud in the dead of night, and completely bypassed Reynolds' heavy guns. "They're hitting the perimeter!" Corporal Jensen yelled, grabbing his rifle. Suddenly, the generator outside was killed. The TOC plunged into absolute blinding darkness. The panicked shouts of junior officers filled the void, accompanied by the chaotic thumping of boots and the frantic racking of charging handles. "Get the backup lights on. Form a defensive perimeter at the door," Reynolds bellowed, but his voice was swallowed by the sheer confusion. They were blind, disorganized, and about to be slaughtered in the simulation. Then, a beam of IR, infrared light, invisible to the naked eye but blinding under night vision goggles, sliced through the dark. "Down!" a female voice commanded. It wasn't a yell, it was a sharp, authoritative bark that cut through the panic like a scalpel. Hayes didn't wait for them to comply. Moving with terrifying speed, she grabbed First Sergeant Miller by the tactical harness and practically hurled the 200-pound man to the floor just as the front flap of the tent was violently kicked open. 3 OPFOR soldiers stormed in, their rifles raised, ready to sweep the room and eliminate the command staff. But Hayes was already in motion. She didn't freeze, she didn't panic. To her, the darkness was an old friend. She had slipped on her panoramic night vision goggles the second the power cut, turning the pitch-black tent into a crisp, green battle space. Before the first OPFOR soldier could sweep his muzzle across the room, Hayes closed the distance. She intercepted his rifle barrel, sweeping it violently upward while simultaneously driving the palm of her hand into his chest, triggering the pressure sensor on his Miles vest. B. The shrill alarm signaled a fatal hit. The second soldier panicked, turning his weapon toward her. Hayes pivoted flawlessly, dropping to one knee to shrink her silhouette. She drew her sidearm in a blur and fired 2 blank rounds point blank into his chest sensor. Beep. The third soldier backed out of the tent, trying to retreat into the mud, but Hayes surged forward. She didn't shoot. She tackled him into the freezing slurry outside, securing his weapon and pinning him with a brutal, joint-locking submission hold that made the infantryman cry out in genuine shock before she tapped his sensor. Beep. Inside the tent, the backup battery lights flickered on, casting a dim red glow over the TOC. Reynolds, Miller, and a dozen staff officers slowly picked themselves up from the floor, their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked out the open tent flap. Samantha Hayes was standing over 3 dead OP-4 soldiers in the mud. She holstered her sidearm, her breathing completely steady. She turned back to Reynolds, who was staring at her as if she were a ghost. "Perimeter is compromised, Commander," Hayes said smoothly. "I suggest you deploy your reserves." The dawn brought a miserable gray light to Grafenver, illuminating the sheer scale of the tactical disaster. Reynolds' battalion had technically survived the night raid, but only just. The OP-4 had inflicted devastating simulated casualties, gutting the command structure and rendering the battalion effectively combat ineffective. It was a humiliating defeat, one that would undoubtedly stain Reynolds' otherwise stellar career. The battalion was assembled in a loose, exhausted formation on the gravel staging area for the After-Action Review, AAR. The men were covered in mud, shivering, and entirely demoralized. Standing at the front of the formation with Reynolds was General William Stark, the NATO exercise commander. Stark was a legend in the special operations community, a man whose chest was heavy with ribbons earned in classified valleys across the globe. Next to Stark stood a massive, heavily bearded man, Command Master Chief John Grip Henderson. Reynolds stood rigidly at attention, his face pale, awaiting the dressing down of his life. "Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds," General Stark began, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the armory. "Your performance last night was, to put it mildly, catastrophic. You failed to anticipate the enemy, you rigidly adhered to an obsolete battle plan, and your command post was breached. Reynolds swallowed hard. Yes, General. However, Stark continued, pacing down the line, I am told that your TOC was not entirely wiped out. I am told that 3 OPFOR breachers were neutralized in hand-to-hand combat by a single individual before they could eliminate the command staff. Is this true? Reynolds hesitated, his eyes shifting to the back of the formation where Samantha Hayes stood quietly in her soaked, mud-caked outer shell. Yes, General, Reynolds admitted, his voice tight. It was the civilian tactical liaison, Miss Hayes. A slow, knowing smile spread across General Stark's weathered face. Beside him, Master Chief Henderson let out a low chuckle. Civilian? Stark repeated. He looked past Reynolds. Chief, get up here. Samantha Hayes stepped out of the formation. She walked to the front, her posture perfect. As she stopped in front of the general, she reached up to the collar of her heavy waterproof shell. The rain had stopped, and the jacket was heavy with mud. She unzipped the shell and pulled it off, revealing her olive-drab combat shirt underneath. Reynolds' eyes immediately locked onto her right shoulder. There, affixed to the Velcro sleeve, was a patch that made the commander's blood run cold. It wasn't the emblem of a Pentagon think tank. It was a subdued, tactical patch depicting a golden eagle clutching an anchor, a trident, and a flintlock pistol. The special warfare insignia, the SEAL Trident. A collective gasp rippled through the ranks of the infantrymen. First Sergeant Miller's eyes bulged. Corporal Jensen dropped his helmet. Lieutenant Colonel, General Stark said quietly, allow me to introduce Chief Special Warfare Operator Samantha Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She is one of the premier CQB and marksmanship instructors for the Tier 1 community. The Pentagon didn't send her here to audit your spreadsheets. I asked her to come here to evaluate your capacity for asymmetric warfare. Reynolds stared at the Trident, completely paralyzed. The arrogant jokes, the mocking on the firing line, the dismissal of her tactical advice, it all came crashing down on him with the weight of a freight train. He had handed an unzeroed garbage rifle to a Tier 1 operator and mocked her when she hit a 500-meter target in a crosswind. He had told a woman who hunted terrorists in the dark for a living that she didn't know how real combat worked. Chief Hayes, General Stark said, turning to her, your assessment of the battalion? Hayes looked at Reynolds. The commander braced himself, expecting her to completely annihilate him in front of his men. She had every right to. The men have heart, General, Hayes said, her voice carrying clearly across the staging area. Corporal Jensen and his squad held the line admirably once the power dropped. First Sergeant Miller maintained discipline under fire. She paused, locking eyes with Reynolds. But leadership failed to respect the enemy's adaptability. The commander believed his plan was flawless because it was loud and heavy. In modern warfare, General, the quiet threats are the ones that kill you. It was a devastating, surgical critique. Reynolds felt his face burn with shame. He didn't just lose the battle, he had lost his pride. Understood, Chief, Stark nodded. He turned back to Reynolds. You have a lot of work to do, Colonel. I suggest you start by listening. Yes, General, Reynolds managed to choke out. As the formation was dismissed, the men scrambled to clean their gear, whispering excitedly about the operator in their midst. Reynolds stood alone in the mud, utterly humbled. He watched as Chief Hayes hoisted her gear bag over her shoulder. She didn't look back. She didn't gloat. She simply walked toward the waiting Black Hawk helicopter, moving with the same quiet, deliberate economy of motion she had arrived with. Reynolds finally understood. True professionals didn't need to shout to prove their worth. They let their actions and their crosshairs do the talking. If you love this incredible true-to-life story of grit, elite skills, and ultimate payback, do us a huge favor and hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves military history and tactical stories, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We upload jaw-dropping stories like this every single week. Ring the notification bell so you never miss out, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite part of Chief Hayes' revenge.